Thank you for coming. So I'm Tom Whitwell. I design the music thing modular stuff. But I'm not talking about that at all today. I'm talking about the history of how synthesizers kind of came to be. And this really starts with this picture, which is one of my favorite pictures of Giorgio Moroder in his studio with his enormous Moog modular. And I think this is the time he was recording I Feel Love with Donna Summer. So in the 70s, you've got this guy creating music for discos with this enormous piece of kind of lab equipment. And to me, that seems like quite a strange thing to happen. I can't really see how that would come to be. It's not an obvious musical thing. So this talk is really about the path of how we got to this strange world that Giorgio Moroder is living in. So often you get talks about musicians, people are used to hearing about musicians, and they get into the history books. At events like this, we talk about the people who invent synthesizers, the people who kind of design gear sometimes. But this talk, I'm going to talk about the people who invent the tools that the people who invent the instruments use to build what they're doing. But I'm not going to start with big, complicated Moog modulars. I'm going to start with this, which is just about the simplest circuit you can build. So this makes 6 oscillators for kind of weird drone synth stuff. And what I found amazing when I built one of these was just how easy it was to do and how so much of the complexity, so much of what's difficult is hidden, because you can buy one little chip like this, which is called a hex Schmitt Trigger, and everything you need to build 6 oscillators and a synthesizer is built into that little device. And the actual circuit is also here this is an 808 drum machine. That same simple circuit here powers the cymbals and the cowbell on an 808 drum machine. So how did this circuit come to be? How did the hex Schmitt Trigger come to be invented? This is Otto Schmitt, who invented the Schmitt Trigger in 1936, I think. And he was a kind of child prodigy. He dropped out of high school to go to university. And he studied physics and biology. And he kind of combined these two things. So his brother was a biologist, an anatomist. This is one of his giant squid that he studied at MIT. And Otto would study animals to figure out how to design electronics. So he studied frogs jumping across lily pads, looked at how they reacted and said, how can I make that into something, how can I make that into a feedback circuit on an electronics thing? He studied the neurons in squid. How did the nerves work in squid's tentacles? How did they pass information? And that was the thing that led him to invent the Schmitt Trigger. So what a Schmitt Trigger does is it takes a kind of wavy analog signal and turns it into a sharp digital signal. And he designed this thing. He published it in 1936, I think. He didn't patent it. He said he didn't want to be a businessman. He wanted to be an inventor. So he gave it away free to the world. And it's one of the most successful electronic inventions there is in the world. Almost every time you press a button on any electronic device, you are triggering a Schmitt Trigger. Any sort of phone or computer will have thousands and thousands of them built into it. But for it to go from being his invention, when he invented it, he was using vacuum tubes. So it was kind of about this big, one of them. And there are now tens of thousands of them in your phone. Obviously, to get smaller, the transistor had to be invented. So this was the first ever transistor that was invented at Princeton by this chap. And he is one of the kind of villains of the piece. So he went on the guy who invented the transistor, during World War II, he was asked to do a forecast of how many casualties there would be if they invaded Japan. And he went away and he studied it. And he came back and said there would be 5 million Japanese casualties and 1 million American casualties. So they said, okay, that doesn't sound good. We will drop atom bombs on it instead. He then, after the war, he was at Princeton. and he led the team that invented the transistor. The first transistor was his team. But he was generally an extremely unpleasant person to work for, an extremely unpleasant person to be around. So he, later in his life, he started publishing papers like this one. So he was extremely racist, as you can tell from his views about Japan. He had very racist views throughout his life. And he was, I said, he was based in Princeton, and he was, after the transistor was invented, he was starting to work out how to commercialize it, how to build it into something that could be mass produced. And at that time, his mother got sick. And so he moved himself and his whole team across the country to be closer to his mother. And his mother lived in Palo Alto in California, which is why Silicon Valley grew up in that area, because he moved all of the people getting started on transistors into that area. And when they were working with him, he was very, very difficult and unpleasant to work for. He did things like, at one point, his secretary hurt her finger, during the day. He arranged lie detector tests for everyone in the company to find out who had sabotaged the company by injuring his secretary's finger. So after a while, this group of people, these were his 8 top people, were called the Treacherous 8 because they all left Shockley Semiconductor and went off to form their own company, staying in Silicon Valley. And this was in some ways one of the first ever Silicon Valley startups. So they all left and they got $1.5 million from a company called Fairchild Photographic. And they set up by themselves in a little space in Silicon Valley. And this was about 1954, 55. And so Fairchild Semiconductor, if you are in this room, you may know Fairchild as people who make very, very high-end valve compressors and studio equipment. But that was a tiny, tiny part of Fairchild. Most of what Fairchild Semiconductor did was they made weapons. They were an enormous arms company, like most of the companies, high-tech companies in Silicon Valley and in California at the time. This was one of their products. They also did the Armalite, which the IRA famously used during the 70s, and the AR-15, which is the kind of assault rifle everyone in America uses. The AR stands for Armalite. That was another kind of Fairchild product. In about 1956, 57, a Fairchild developer developed the first integrated circuit. So this is one of the first proper semiconductor, first sort of silicon chip. So this was meaning transistors got smaller and smaller and smaller. And their chips were used in the Apollo program. So the guidance computer that Mary Hamilton's code ran on was running Fairchild chips. They also sold lots and lots of chips to build nuclear missiles, because that's the kind of company they were. They seemed to be a very, I don't know if everyone was strange in those days, but Fairchild seemed to be quite a weird company. This was before you had outsourcing to the Far East. So when Fairchild were looking for cheap labor to build their chips, they went to Native American, kind of Indian reservations in Utah. And they built a factory in Utah with 1,000, essentially, Native American women worked there for kind of low wages and I think lots and lots of tax benefits. But what was weird was the way they presented this. So in the brochure the day they opened in Utah, they had these 2 images and they said, essentially, what the women were doing was craft production, because they were very good at making rugs. And as you can see, silicon chips look quite a lot like rugs. Anyway, so we've now got the inventions of Otto Schmitt and all these other people, and transistors have been invented, and they're in the middle of Silicon Valley building this stuff. How do we get from there to Giorgio Moroder and his enormous wall of synthesizers? So round the corner from Fairchild Semiconductor in Palo Alto was a club called the Big Beat Club, which was quite a rundown nightclub. And in 1965, I think November 1965, this event with an extremely slickly presented poster, this was one of the acid tests, one of the first kind of full-size acid tests held by the Merry Pranksters. So the Merry Pranksters was Ken Kesey, who was already a best-selling author by that stage. And he had got hold of a load of LSD from Switzerland. He was the first person to call LSD acid, was Ken Kesey. And at events like this, they've been gradually building up. And so he had the Grateful Dead playing at one end of the room. He had people doing talks. He had talks about Native American stuff happening there. You had lots of strobing lights, lots of black lights, lots of this stuff happening. And it was a kind of prototype for what we would see as being nightclubs and what we'd be seeing as that kind of psychedelic experience that came later. The sort of link between the electronics world of Fairchild and the Big Beat Club was Don Buchler. So Don was working for NASA at the time. He was doing lots of different projects for NASA. He was kind of freelance electronics engineer for them. One of his projects was to find out whether you can send chimpanzees to Venus. It turns out you can't send chimpanzees to Venus. He did other things like sending yeast up into the stratosphere where it could grow and you could see what happens to things evolve differently in the stratosphere. So during the day he was working for NASA. At night he was hanging out with Ken Kesey and all of that kind of group. So when the Merry Pranksters set off across America in 1962 in this bus, they would drive around America literally handing out LSD to people. But a big part of it wasn't just the drugs, it was also loud, freaky, distorted music. So behind or just by the wing mirror in this bus was this box, which is Don Buchler built them a PA system. So you've got a kind of microphone preamps and spring reverbs and stuff. And this was Tom Wolfe went on tour with the Merry Pranksters. And this was his description of what was coming out of the Buchler sound system. So it was this kind of loud, distorted, weird music, which was obviously quite new at that stage. A couple of months after the event in Palo Alto, they did this event, which was the Trips Festival in San Francisco. And I always think this looks so contemporary, this image. It looks pretty much like any of the rooms out there. This guy with the microphone is Ken Babbs, who was part of the Merry Pranksters gang. He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and early in the Vietnam War in kind of 1964, 63, 64, he went out and was flying helicopters across the jungle. And Ken Kesey was sending him acid to try while he was doing that. And later on he did say that that probably wasn't the best environment to be experimenting with acid. So we're now gradually getting, you can see all the pieces are in place. And that I really haven't worked out a conclusion to this talk. That was essentially the way you got this connection between the world of high tech and the world of electronics and the world of weird, loud electronic music. And they met in that little tiny point in the middle of San Francisco in the 1960s. And that's my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
You described the early group synths. How did that evolve? How do you go from the group blocks to what the guy was like?
So I think when you look here, what I think, so Buchler's first kind of contract to build something was from the San Francisco Tape Music Center. And this was kind of experimental from the sort of academic art world. And at the time, they had very, very primitive, the electronic studios had very, very primitive equipment. So if you were to go to kind of Cologne or Paris, the equipment they had was tape recorders, single track, maybe 2-track tape recorders. They had these scientific kind of oscillators that could do one pitch, and then you turn the knob and they do a different pitch. They had ring modulators that could kind of play two oscillators off against each other. And maybe spring reverbs, things like that. But that was really all they had. And the people at the Tape Music Center described how when Don Buchler arrived with this kind of NASA background and this experience of using all the new electronics and the new tools he had, they were able to say to him, I want to do this, and he was able to work out ways of doing it. So one of the things they wanted to do was, if you've got multiple tape recorders, can you mix between them rather than having to slice the tape up? So one of the first things he built was a kind of touch keyboard that you could plug 8 different signals into, and you would mix it by touching panels, which I think is the little box up on the top there. I think at events like this, they were using it more for flying sound around the rooms. They'd have multiple speakers around the room. They might have a band playing, and instead of just synthesizing sound and oscillators and things, they were using it to trigger the sound moving around the room in different ways, as I understand it.
What's the most advanced synthesizer that anyone made with kind of like pre-transistor valves, I guess? So all the theremins that you hear in the kind of 50s
Yeah.
are all valve-based.
So the theremins were, was that there was, in fact, we were in New York a couple of months ago, and RCA paid for this enormous valve synthesizer to be built, which is now at Columbia University in New York. And that was like a big primitive analog computer. So it had paper, punched tape to trigger valve oscillators, valve filters, I think. It had a kind of binary system that you could program to run through. But it was literally, it's sort of half the size of this room. It cost, I think, $150,000. I don't know if you remember what they told us. They said the idea of it was RCA was the TV company. The idea was that they would be able to use it to replace orchestras and it would save them money. That was how it was pitched. In fact, it was so complicated and difficult to use that really only one of the composers at Columbia ever got anything out of it. But it was so the idea, doing it on that scale really wasn't practical. Thank you.